The proposed U.S. takeover of Venezuela fits a long historical pattern of American intervention in Latin America, where claims of liberation mask economic and geopolitical self-interest. From Guatemala to Chile, the result has rarely been democracy, but instability, repression, and dependency. Venezuela's crisis is real, but it has been worsened by sanctions that strangled its economy and punished ordinary people. An external military intervention would further undermine Venezuelan sovereignty and set a dangerous precedent. A nation cannot be bombed into democracy, especially when foreign powers openly discuss controlling its resources.
This situation differs fundamentally from Cold War interventions. Venezuela today is ruled by an authoritarian regime that stole elections, collapsed its economy, and exported instability across the region. Millions of refugees have fled, overwhelming neighboring countries. Maduro is not a legitimate leader, but a criminal indicted for narco-terrorism. When a regime actively harms its people and destabilizes others, the international community has a responsibility to act. This is not imperial conquest, but targeted intervention to remove a dictator and allow Venezuelans to reclaim democratic governance they were denied.
Calling this intervention responsibility ignores how external pressure created the conditions you now cite as justification. Sanctions devastated oil revenues, crippled public services, and accelerated migration. You cannot first economically suffocate a country and then claim humanitarian concern when it collapses. Moreover, selective morality is evident. The U.S. maintains close relations with authoritarian governments elsewhere when it suits strategic interests. Venezuela's crime and corruption are real, but they do not grant Washington the authority to decide another nation's fate through force, especially without international consensus or legal authorization.
Sanctions did not cause Venezuela's collapse, they followed it. The economy was already imploding due to corruption, nationalization failures, and mismanagement long before major sanctions were imposed. Blaming external pressure absolves Maduro's regime of responsibility for policies that destroyed productivity and living standards. As for selectivity, international action often reflects urgency and scale. Venezuela's crisis is uniquely severe and regionally destabilizing. Waiting for perfect multilateral consensus while people starve and gangs expand power only protects the regime, not the citizens suffering under it.
If humanitarian concern were the genuine motivation, diplomatic solutions would be prioritized rather than military threats. Intervention often escalates violence and empowers hardliners, while civilians pay the price. History shows that removing a leader rarely resolves structural problems. Instead, it creates power vacuums exploited by militias and foreign interests. The rhetoric of quick strikes and temporary control mirrors past interventions that became prolonged occupations. Once foreign troops and corporate interests enter, sovereignty is compromised, and promises of withdrawal fade, leaving long-term instability rather than self-determination for the population.
Diplomacy has been attempted for years with no success because Maduro uses negotiations as delay tactics while entrenching power. Meanwhile, opposition leaders are jailed or exiled, elections manipulated, and humanitarian aid blocked. Military action is not the first choice, but the last resort when peaceful options fail. A decisive intervention can prevent prolonged civil conflict by removing the source of repression swiftly. Allowing a narco-state to persist risks greater regional instability. Short-term force, paired with a clear exit strategy, can create space for genuine political transition.
The claim of a clear exit strategy is precisely what history contradicts. Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya were all framed as limited interventions, yet their consequences linger decades later. Foreign powers underestimate the complexity of societies they intervene in and overestimate their ability to engineer outcomes. Furthermore, public statements about managing Venezuela's oil resources undermine any moral credibility. When leaders openly discuss extracting wealth, it reinforces the perception that intervention is driven by economic gain rather than human rights, eroding trust domestically and internationally.
Past failures should inform better planning, not paralyze action. Iraq and Afghanistan involved nation building on a massive scale, which is not the objective here. The goal is regime removal and stabilization, not remaking Venezuelan society. Oil management discussions reflect practical realities. Restoring production funds reconstruction and prevents rival powers from exploiting chaos. Ignoring resources would be irresponsible. Transparency about economic plans is preferable to pretending economics are irrelevant. The ultimate objective remains restoring order so Venezuelans can govern themselves without fear or repression.
Restoring order through force risks legitimizing a dangerous global norm, powerful states intervening whenever they deem another government illegitimate. This undermines international law and invites reciprocal actions by other powers. If the U.S. claims authority to remove leaders it indicts, what prevents Russia or China from applying the same logic elsewhere? The erosion of norms does not create security, it accelerates global instability. Sovereignty exists precisely to prevent might makes right logic from dominating international relations, even when internal governance is deeply flawed.
International law cannot be a shield for regimes committing large-scale crimes against their population and exporting harm abroad. Sovereignty is not absolute when a government forfeits legitimacy through systematic abuse. Comparing this to potential actions by authoritarian rivals ignores context. Maduro's regime is criminally implicated in drug trafficking affecting other nations. Intervention is grounded in concrete threats, not abstract ideology. Allowing such regimes to operate freely emboldens others. Enforcing consequences deters future abuses and reinforces, rather than erodes, meaningful international norms.
Deterrence through unilateral force often produces the opposite effect, fostering resentment and anti-American sentiment that fuels extremism. Regional governments, including those critical of Maduro, have condemned military intervention because they recognize its destabilizing potential. Latin America's historical memory of U.S. interventions shapes this resistance. Ignoring regional voices while claiming to act on their behalf is paternalistic. Sustainable change must come from internal political processes supported diplomatically, not imposed externally through violence that risks civilian casualties and long-term dependency.
Regional condemnation is often driven by political posturing rather than concern for Venezuelans themselves. Many governments quietly welcome decisive action that could reduce refugee flows and criminal networks. Public opposition does not negate private relief. Moreover, internal change has been violently suppressed. Expecting purely domestic solutions under an entrenched authoritarian regime is unrealistic. External intervention can reset conditions, allowing internal actors to operate freely. Rejecting force categorically ignores the reality that some regimes only fall when pressure becomes unavoidable.
Even if intervention removed Maduro, there is no guarantee of a stable or democratic successor. Fragmented opposition groups, competing interests, and external influence could plunge the country into further chaos. Power vacuums often empower armed factions rather than civil institutions. Additionally, humanitarian crises frequently worsen during military campaigns, disrupting infrastructure and supply chains. The ethical cost of intervention cannot be measured solely by intentions, but by predictable outcomes, many of which history suggests would be severe and long-lasting.
No transition is risk-free, but inaction also has predictable outcomes: continued repression, economic collapse, and regional destabilization. Opposition fragmentation exists precisely because the regime suppresses political organization. Removing that pressure allows legitimate leadership to emerge. International oversight and limited stabilization forces can mitigate chaos. The humanitarian situation is already dire. Intervention aims to stop the bleeding, not worsen it. Ethical responsibility includes acting when non-action guarantees continued suffering and regional harm.
Your argument assumes external actors can control complex post-conflict dynamics, an assumption repeatedly disproven. International oversight often morphs into dependency, with local governance sidelined by foreign advisors and interests. This undermines legitimacy and fuels resistance. Moreover, focusing on regime change diverts attention from addressing broader systemic issues like inequality, corruption, and global economic pressures. Without tackling these root causes, any imposed transition risks reproducing instability under a different leadership, aligned with foreign priorities rather than popular needs.
Addressing systemic issues requires a minimum level of security and governance, which Maduro's regime actively prevents. Regime change is not a cure-all, but a prerequisite for reform. External assistance does not inherently negate sovereignty. It can empower institutions when structured correctly. The alternative, allowing a criminal regime to persist, ensures systemic problems worsen. Perfection should not be the enemy of progress. Stabilization creates the conditions necessary for addressing inequality and corruption through domestic political processes.
Progress defined by external actors often prioritizes market access and geopolitical alignment over social welfare. The emphasis on oil production and foreign investment risks, repeating extractive models that historically enriched elites while marginalizing communities. True recovery requires inclusive economic planning shaped by Venezuelans themselves. Military intervention skews that process from the outset. Moreover, civilian casualties and displacement caused by intervention would deepen trauma, complicating reconciliation and nation-building efforts long after the immediate conflict ends.
Economic recovery without restoring production capacity is impossible. Oil revenues are essential for funding social programs and rebuilding infrastructure. External involvement does not preclude inclusive planning. It can provide resources and expertise otherwise unavailable. Civilian harm is a serious concern, which is why precision and limited objectives matter. The current trajectory already inflicts mass suffering. Intervention seeks to shorten the crisis, not prolong it, enabling Venezuelans to rebuild with international support rather than under authoritarian collapse.
The notion that military force can be calibrated to minimize harm often proves illusory in practice. Even precision strikes disrupt civilian life and generate unintended consequences. Furthermore, bypassing domestic democratic processes in the intervening country undermines accountability. Decisions of war and peace made unilaterally concentrate power dangerously. A truly ethical approach would involve lifting sanctions, supporting regional mediation, and prioritizing humanitarian aid without political conditions, allowing Venezuelans space to resolve their crisis organically.
Lifting sanctions without regime change would funnel resources back into corrupt networks, strengthening repression. Mediation efforts have repeatedly failed because the regime negotiates in bad faith. Democratic accountability within the intervening country is important, but urgency sometimes demands executive action to prevent greater harm. Humanitarian aid alone cannot resolve a political crisis enforced through violence. Combining targeted force with reconstruction planning offers a realistic path to ending prolonged suffering rather than perpetuating a stalemate that benefits only those in power.
Executive-driven intervention sets a troubling domestic precedent, weakening democratic oversight and normalizing perpetual conflict. When leaders can initiate military actions without broad consent, public trust erodes. Internationally, this reinforces perceptions of hypocrisy when democratic norms are selectively applied. Long-term peace requires strengthening international institutions and conflict resolution mechanisms, not bypassing them. Venezuela's tragedy should motivate reform of global governance, not unilateral actions that deepen divisions and undermine collective security frameworks.
Democratic oversight remains essential, but paralysis in the face of urgent threats can be equally damaging. International institutions are often immobilized by vetoes and political interests, leaving crises unresolved. While reform is desirable, it cannot substitute for action when lives are at stake. Unilateral action, though imperfect, can catalyze change and force stalled systems to respond. The credibility of democratic values depends not only on procedure, but on the willingness to defend populations against brutal regimes.
Defending populations should not mean substituting one form of domination for another. True solidarity respects self-determination, even when outcomes are uncertain or uncomfortable. External intervention often narrows political options, empowering factions aligned with foreign interests while marginalizing grassroots movements. Over time, this distorts political culture and entrenches dependency. Venezuela's future must be shaped by its people, supported by international cooperation that prioritizes peace, economic justice, and regional stability rather than coercive regime change.
Self-determination loses meaning when a regime eliminates genuine choice through repression and fraud. Supporting the Venezuelan people requires removing obstacles to political expression, including authoritarian control. External action does not inherently negate agency, it can restore it. Grassroots movements cannot thrive under constant threat. By removing the regime, intervention opens political space. Cooperation and justice become possible only after security is established. Waiting for organic change under tyranny condemns millions to indefinite suffering.
Your framing reduces complex societies to obstacles requiring removal, oversimplifying the causes of crisis. External force often hardens nationalist sentiment and fuels resistance, prolonging instability. Additionally, the economic costs of intervention divert resources from domestic needs in the intervening country, raising questions about priorities. Citizens are asked to fund wars abroad while social issues persist at home. This disconnect undermines democratic legitimacy and fuels polarization, ultimately weakening the very values intervention claims to defend.
Addressing external threats and domestic needs are not mutually exclusive. Instability abroad often generates costs at home through migration, crime, and economic disruption. Strategic intervention can prevent larger, more expensive crises later. Nationalist backlash is a risk, but it already exists under authoritarian propaganda. Removing the regime weakens that narrative. Simplification is unavoidable in urgent decision-making. Perfection is impossible. The choice is between managed risk now and escalating instability that imposes greater costs over time.
Managed risk has repeatedly underestimated long-term consequences, locking societies into cycles of intervention and resistance. Each action creates new grievances that justify further involvement. Breaking this cycle requires restraint and a commitment to non-military solutions, even when slow. Venezuela's suffering is undeniable, but transforming it into a battlefield risks multiplying victims. Ethical foreign policy should prioritize harm reduction globally, recognizing that power exercised without consent often generates the very crises it seeks to resolve.
Restraint without leverage enables regimes to entrench themselves. Non-military solutions depend on the willingness of those in power to engage, which is absent here. Cycles of intervention occur when threats are left unresolved, not when they are decisively addressed. The objective is not endless involvement, but removing a source of harm. Ethical responsibility includes preventing foreseeable atrocities. Inaction can be as morally consequential as action when suffering continues unchecked.
Ultimately, this debate centers on whether force can ever legitimately substitute for consent in shaping a nation's future. History suggests it cannot. Even well-intentioned interventions carry structural biases favoring powerful actors and economic interests. Venezuela's crisis demands global solidarity, debt relief, lifted sanctions, and sustained diplomatic engagement, not military domination. True stability arises when people control their political and economic destiny without external coercion. Anything less risks repeating a tragic pattern under a new justification.
Consent is meaningless when denied by an authoritarian regime through violence and fraud. Force is not a substitute for consent, but a means to restore the possibility of it. Venezuela's tragedy will not resolve through patience alone. Strategic intervention, limited in scope and duration, can remove barriers to self-determination and reduce regional harm. History offers failures, but also successes when decisive action stopped greater suffering. The moral challenge is choosing the least harmful path, not avoiding responsibility altogether.